Hello, John.
Hello, Will.
How are you today?
Not bad. How are you?
I'm outstanding. I am, for the benefit of our viewers, Will Wilkinson at the Cato Institute, and you are?
I'm John Nye, and I'm at George Mason University at the Mercator Center.
Now, John, I understand you just came to the George Mason University from out west. You are an economic historian. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Now, explain to me a little bit about economic history. Is it like you're sort of like a chimera, kind of a historian, kind of an economist, a little bit of both?
Yes, it's a very interesting field. To begin with, I should probably explain that it's not what some people think of, which is people often confuse history of economic thought with economic history. History of economic thought is concerned with discussing the ideas of the great classical economists, people like Smith and Ricardo. That's not what I do. What I do is economic history, which is the application of economic analysis and statistical techniques to the study of the past. In particular, we are very focused on the rise of the modern economy, and in particular the rise of the developed world, although we spend a lot of time looking also at the economic history of the entire world. So that, for instance, things like the Industrial Revolution would count as economic history, or looking at the macroeconomic performance of Italy in the 15th century would be economic history. And that's sort of what I do.
Now, how data intensive is economic history? I imagine this involves rummaging through archives and finding out what the prices of things were. Is there a lot of detective work involved in economic history?
There is quite a bit. It really depends. For certain types of work, there's a great deal of published material, and so a lot of economic history is about taking that published material, collating it, and then putting it in a format that is then amenable to statistical analysis. Sometimes it's not very different from the work that standard history does, where you spend a lot of time in archives, you spend a lot of time in libraries, just trying to figure out what people said or did. I think one of the big differences is that economic historians will often put the historical material in the context of what's known about economic history, of economic theory, and will spend a lot more time analyzing numerical data to the extent that they're available. There's a lot less attention, say, to text per se, and a lot less attention paid to necessarily what contemporaries said about things, although that's part of the work as well. But there's very often an attempt to find out how aggregates behave. There's very much an attempt to draw lessons about social science, to try to, in some sense, derive the social science of the past.
Now, John, most of the economic history I learned from you and your former colleague Doug North. And since I've gotten into economic history, it's made me really deeply dissatisfied with the sort of normal run-of-the-mill history that you get, which normally is just the stuff that you see on the History Channel. It seems like, or even in your history book when you're in ninth grade. History seems like it's always just the history of presidents and wars. But the real story seems to almost always be the economic story, like what the underlying forces are doing to a culture and economy are often sort of like invisible from the level of, here's what Grover Cleveland was doing, or you don't even really understand why the war is happening unless you understand the economic dynamics. And so do you turn on the History Channel and get frustrated with the sort of superficiality of the history that they present?
Well, not exactly. I mean, different types of history accomplish different types of things. I do get frustrated whenever there's a discussion about broader forces, and particularly about the role of economics, since very often, the economy impinges on so many things that we do today or that happen in history, but many of the people who discuss these economic ideas don't have a theoretical or analytic context in which to put these discussions. So in that sense, I get very frustrated. At the same time, I wouldn't try to claim that what I do is all of history. There's a great deal of so-called traditional history that's extremely valuable, and I enjoy watching the History Channel. I think the difference is that when one wants to think about many of these social forces, when one wants to think about the role of the economy, the role of taxes, the role of prices, the role of changes in regulation and the way they affect the world, then I think simply observing what people did or said is often a very imperfect guide to thinking about what happened. Moreover, you really need a framework to decide which kinds of facts matter and how you're going to aggregate those facts. And so, for instance, a very detailed documentary about, say, a small town in 17th century Germany, or at least in one of the German states at the time, since there was no Germany, will not necessarily get you certain types of insights about what's happening to the macroeconomy or what's really happening to standard of living and things of that sort. You can learn certain types of things, but you may be misled about various others. In much the same way that, for instance, it's not clear to me that you would want to really talk about what's happened to the U.S. economy just by reading the headlines of the latest newspapers or Time or Newsweek. And I think in that sense, economic historians do for the past what modern economists, or rather specialists in the contemporary economics, do for contemporary economic events.
You're telling...
Yes, go ahead.
You're telling the story behind the story, right?
Yeah, to some extent, that's right. Well, you're figuring out ways in which the story is modulated by other stories that you never think of asking.
Well, let's talk about the story that you've been telling recently. John, you've just published a book from Princeton University Press called War, Wine, and Taxes, The Political Economy of Anglo-French Trade from 1689 to 1900. Now, war, wine, and taxes, I think everybody enjoys at least one of those things. I found
or not having one of those.
What's that?
No, or not having some of those things. That's right.
Yeah, I enjoy not having some of those things. I won't tell you which. I found this to be an incredibly fascinating book, and for our readers' benefit, or our viewers' benefit, I think Princeton has the first chapter available for free online, so we'll have a link to that.
You want to show the cover? Yeah.
Yeah, show the cover.
There's nothing an academic likes better than to talk about his book. Here it is, War, Wine, and Taxes.
Now, the first surprising thing that I learned from your book was that England wasn't really the free trader that I had been brought up to think it was. You say that the sort of idea that the free trading England is a myth. How did you discover that, and why is that the case?
Well, all of us were raised with the sort of conventional wisdom that England was the great free trader of the 19th century. I certainly believe that. All my history books said that. All my economics professors teaching the material took that for granted. So that when I was working on this material, in particular, I was doing work on trade in the 19th century, and actually I was focusing not on England, but on France. My specialty tends to be France. And one of the things that struck me is that when I did something very standard in economics of trade, which is I compared what's called average tariff rates, that is to say the value of all the import revenues earned by England and France divided by the value of all their imports. And what I found that when you compared average tariff rates in Britain and France for most of the 19th century, surprisingly, British average tariffs were higher than those of France for something like 70 or 80 years of the 19th century, which is certainly surprising given that Britain was supposed to become a free trader after 1840 with the repeal of the Corn Laws, and considering that the French never claimed to have been free traders and claimed to were often accused of being protectionist, and were often quite proud of it. So that was a big surprise to me. Since then, I spent a lot of time doing statistical analysis and secondary kinds of calculations to show that this measure wasn't some kind of an anomalous statistical blip, but that in fact British tariffs were in fact substantially higher than the French. And then as I got into that, I started to try to understand, well, if this is true, how could we have thought so differently for so long? And what did this say about economic history and what we've learned? And in some sense, that's where the book came out. But the short answer is that why do we think Britain was a free trader? Because they told us so.
And but they were lying.
Well, lying, I think, is the wrong word, because I think the British were moving towards very free trade throughout the 19th century. The only difference is that they were, if you like, exaggerating the speed at which they were making that transformation.
So John, let's back up for just 1 second, and can you tell our viewers what the sort of potted economic history, the conceived wisdom about free trade England was? Can you just briefly describe that to make it clear why what you're finding is important?
Okay, so the basic story is something like the following. Britain, like the rest of Europe, through the 18th and early 19th century was a protectionist. That is to sort of say they weren't very free trade. They had lots of tariffs, which restricted trade and restricted particularly imports from other nations, that the mercantilists, or at least what was referred to as the mercantilist philosophy, which dominated economic policy throughout Europe, was that you should maintain a surplus whenever possible in order to preserve bullion. And that if you had too many imports, if you had a huge trade deficit, that was bad, and you should do your best to get down that deficit. If that required raising tariffs on imports, so much the better. Sometime around the 1840s, the British decided to challenge this notion, partly as a result of, by that time, over half a century's worth of writing by economic liberals, beginning with Adam Smith. And in the 1840s, the British had an extremely contentious battle to remove something called the Corn Laws. And the Corn Laws were these agricultural tariffs on grain of all kinds, corn being the generic term for grain. So in fact, most of the Corn Laws were aimed at not corn, in today's term, but wheat. And the result of that battle, which led to the complete repeal of the Corn Laws and the dismantling of many other tariffs, led to Britain being labeled as the first free trader. In contrast, most other countries in Europe resisted publicly this claim or the desire to move towards free trade, and that Europe, for the most part, did not move towards very much free trade till later in the end of the century. What I found was that, in fact, the British had removed the Corn Laws, but in fact had not removed many of the tariffs that had been most critical to the mercantile system of 100 years earlier. And it is that fact that's at the core, or at least at the start of my book.
Okay,
go ahead.
Sorry. That's a great summary, John. Now, let's get briefly to a couple of the other terms in your title, wine and taxes. Now, so I understand then that the tariff that the English didn't remove was their tariff on wine and other kinds of alcohol. Can you tell us about that and describe why they were so resistant to repealing their tax on alcohol?
Well, let me back up. I think it's first important to understand what happened. Okay. So part of the misunderstanding is that the British had, compared to the French, relatively few tariffs in the mid-19th century. But the few tariffs they had were extremely high and extremely important. That is, they were on a very important part of British trade. In particular, they were a very important part of British comestibles, which is to sort of say they were tariffs on alcohol, that is wine and spirits, rum, but they were also tariffs on things like sugar, coffee, tea, and things like coffee and tea were also beverages. And sugar was a major import into the distilling industry. That is to sort of say, major input, rather. That is to sort of say, sugar is one of the largest single inputs into the distilling industry and is used very often in the making of spirits of various kinds. So these tariffs were a very, very large part of the British overall trade picture, and they served to distort British trade dramatically. So in trying to understand why Britain was less of a free trader than people have claimed, and why it was ignored, it required understanding these tariffs, in particular the tariff on wine, and where they had come from. And it's that research that led to the book.
Now, I think it's important for people to understand, at this point in time, nations like England and France, their public finance, the way they raised money, was largely through things like tariffs. They didn't have much by way of income taxes or anything like that. So the government is raising most of its money.
That's not quite true. That's not quite true, because the major source of revenue for, say, the British were excise taxes. That is, they were domestic. Customs were a major part of the budget, but they also raised a great deal of their money, in fact, more of their money, from excises, which were domestic sales taxes, let's say either sales taxes or production taxes, on things like beer or things like tobacco or things of that sort. In addition, many countries had direct taxes on land and property. There wasn't much of an income tax to speak of. What you had was property taxes, and you had taxes in many countries, like in France, which proxied for property taxes. For instance, you had taxes on doors and windows, because the presumption was that if you were relatively wealthy and owned a dwelling, and then the number of doors and windows was sort of a proxy for sort of how grand that dwelling was, and so you were taxing those items as well. Moreover, a large of others, goods that were often considered to be for the middle classes were often taxed as well, which would include things like various kinds of times you might have various taxes on either clothing, or there would be salt taxes or things of that sort.
All right. Well, tell us a little bit more then about why the British taxed wine so heavily. Good.
So now this is an interesting question. So it turns out that this is the part of the story that's ignored. That is, first you have to understand that when people look at the 19th century, they sort of said, well, Britain removed all these tariffs on goods, but most of the tariffs they removed were on manufacturers. But manufacturers were exactly what the British were very good at. They had a comparative advantage in manufacturers. They were their dominant, after all, the British had this little thing called the Industrial Revolution. So for Britain to remove the tariffs on manufacturers would be a little bit like Japan sort of saying, let's go to free trade by removing tariffs on cars and electronics. Well, guess what? Japan is really great at making cars and electronics. But the Japanese aren't really good at growing rice, and they have very high tariffs or other kinds of trade restrictions on the imports of rice. Well, in fact, that's kind of what the British did. The British removed tariffs mostly on items on which they had a comparative advantage or were very good at producing, or were on items which were trivial in the overall trade picture. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, items that were very important for the trade, such as comestibles, including wine and spirits, were taxed very, very heavily at the import stage. And to understand that, and to understand how that affected 19th century tariffs, I had to go back in time. It turns out, how far did I have to go back in time? Well, from the mid and late 1800s, I went back all the way to the late 1600s. And that's where the story begins. It turns out that in the 17th century, Britain was running a huge trade deficit, and most of the trade deficit was with a single country, her arch rival, France. And the French were exporting a great deal of wine and luxury items like linens and cloth to Britain in the 17th century. And protectionists then, as protectionists now, aren't very happy with trade deficits. And they agitated for a long time to try to raise tariffs on France, which they did to some extent. But for the most part, the British continued to import large amounts of stuff from the French. What changed? In 1689, in the period from roughly 1689 to about 1713 or 1714, Britain was engaged in 2 wars with France. During those 2 wars, there were, unsurprisingly, few or no imports from France. That is to sort of say, trade with France was essentially cut off. During this time period, British drinkers, therefore, had to depend very heavily on domestic product, that is to sort of say beer and British-produced spirits, as well as colonial spirits, and to a lesser extent, the spirits and wine from favored nations, which were in particular Spain and Portugal. When the war ended, unsurprisingly, you have these groups now which had been protected for about a quarter century, which were making money hand over fist. After the war ends, they want to return to the status quo ante. They want to return to normal trade with France. But now you have all these interest groups which have grown up in Britain to enjoy a situation in which there's no competition from French alcohol, and they lobby the British to impose tariffs on the French, and now they do. That is, beginning in the early 1700s, the British impose very, very high tariffs on French wine. So much so that if you compare the volume of French exports of wine to Britain, say in the early 1700s, compared to what it had been before the war, French exports to Britain of wine fall by about 95% or more, which is really astonishing.
Now, the what I think is the funnest part of this book is that then this helps describe to us, and speaking of like the story behind the story, right? Everybody knows that the English are beer quaffing peoples, and the French are snobs for good wine. Now, your story helps explain why it is that the English are beer drinkers and the French make great wine. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came to be?
Yes, well, to some extent, I mean, part of what's going on is that in the 17th century, wine is very much an expensive product, and it's very much confined to the upper classes, but it's starting to migrate down to the middle classes, and wine drinking is becoming increasingly common. Well, of course, with the war and with the tariffs, that ends. With the end of the war, during the 18th century, is a period of great expansion in the British economy, great expansion in the British population, but a huge inability to access wine. Even the wine from friendly nations, such as Spain or Portugal, are taxed at a high rate relative to what they were in the 17th century. As a result, of course, wine is cut off from the British economy. That is to say, the wine that gets imported is predominantly the very best wine. And so the only wine that gets imported is wine that the aristocrats are drinking, and the ordinary people are resorting to beer, rum, whiskey, and, of course, gin. A very interesting thing about, I will add about, this is where the economics plays it, an interesting thing about the way the tariffs operated is the British tariffs on French wine were per volume. That is to sort of say there was a tax of such and such, so many, say, pounds per barrel or per gallon of wine. Now, that has an interesting effect. You see, most tariffs, just as most taxes today, are ad valorem. That is, they're calculated as a percentage of the value of the product. So, for instance, if you went to a store and you had a 10% tax on wine, you'd pay $1 on a $10 bottle of wine. But, of course, think about what the effect is of a volume tariff. If, for instance, to simplify, you have a $10 a bottle tariff on wine, that effectively means that $1 bottle of wine becomes an $11 bottle of wine at the retail store. Well, that means, for all intents and purposes, you just don't buy that really bad wine anymore. On the other hand, if you're importing a $100 bottle of wine, then a $10 a bottle increase is not very big. So this tariff is going to have the effect of clearly eliminating trade in the cheapest and most common wines, while preserving the trade in the best wine, which are exactly the kinds of wines that the British upper classes are more likely to drink. In contrast, it is the cheapest wines that have the best chance of being even partially competitive with beer or with other domestic substitutes for alcohol. And so, unsurprisingly, under that kind of regime, the British, particularly if you say during the 18th century you have the rise of the middle classes, you have the Industrial Revolution, you have the doubling and tripling of the population, well, during this period, there's basically no wine for the masses. They're drinking beer. So,
now,
just at the time.
You also describe how it is that the British are able to use this high tariff on wine as a lever to extract funds from the domestic beer makers, right? So
Yes, that's one of the interesting things about this story. That is to sort of say the British, like all the European nations, want to raise taxes, or at least throughout the 17th century, want to raise taxes and want to extract more revenue. The problems they have is time and again, whenever they raise taxes, if they have higher taxes on salt or beer or things of that sort, you get a great deal of resistance and you get a lot of non-compliance, and you find out that very often it's more trouble than it's worth. That is to say, even raising the tax rate substantially net you very little increase in revenue, or an increase in revenue that you actually, under some situations, get an actual decrease in revenue. Or when you do get an increase, you find out that the costs of collection are very, very high.
So that's interesting. Is that part of John? Is that part of the dynamic of the sort of the so-called Laffer curve? That if you raise the tax, you get less compliance, and so you don't actually raise the revenue.
Well, certainly that's certainly part of that, but you don't have to think about it as a Laffer curve. You don't have to believe the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve is a more sort of a macro statement. You just have to sort of observe the fact that all economists would agree that at some point, as you raise taxes, even you're going to get more resistance. As you raise taxes, you simply don't assume that people stay in place. That in general, people respond to incentives. When tax rates rise, people find ways to avoid them. And whether or not that actually leads to a Laffer kind of effect. The Laffer effect is much stronger. The Laffer effect says that at some point when you raise taxes, you actually lower total revenues. Well, you don't need to believe that the Laffer effect is always working for it to be relevant. So you can believe, for instance, that you raise taxes by, say, 40%, but you find that revenues only go up by 5%. That's not a pure Laffer kind of effect, but that's still relevant. So they may find that the political fallout from raising taxes by 40% for a mere 5% increase in revenues may not be worth the effort.
Now, I interrupted your earlier story about why it is that they're using the tariff to extract money from the brewers.
Well, so this is the interesting thing about the 18th century. You sort of say, now you have all these domestic producers, or you have these British interests who are making money as a result of the tariff. And a cynic would sort of say, well, is the government going to sit still and let them take all that gain for themselves? And the answer is no. Because what happens? Now, the British the British state has both a carrot and a stick. That is to sort of say, they can sort of say, we're going to raise excises on beer, and by the way, make sure you pay it. Because if you don't, there's always the possibility that all we have to do is lower the tariff on French wine. Because in the French wine case, it's clear that there the Laffer effect is very strong. That is, tariffs are so high that the effect on French imports is virtually prohibitive. And it's certainly the case that with a much lower tariff, the volume of French wine would lead to much, much more total revenue, even if the rate of tariff of taxes on French wine were substantially lower. There, the Laffer effect is clear.
Nice.
And so what happens is that the British state and the brewers now, in some sense, are locked in this dance where the brewers want more benefits from the state, but the state wants the brewers to pay for it. But to some extent, it's not the brewers who pay for it. Who pays for it? It's the British consumer. They pay for it through less access to alcohol and through higher prices. Moreover, the state wants to be able to negotiate with the brewers, and so they encourage oligopoly. That is, they encourage brewing to become much more concentrated. Part of that concentration is technological. That is to sort of say, during the period of the late 1600s and early 1700s, beer goes through what's known as the brewing industrial revolution. That is to sort of say, economies of scale in the changes in technology make it possible to brew large quantities of beer at much lower prices in sort of large vats in the factories. But in addition, the government starts to place restrictions on entry into the beer industry so that effectively you go from having hundreds and hundreds of small brewers to having something like 24, and then later on maybe 18 or even 12 or 10 brewers dominating the industry and producing the bulk of all beer for the London market, which is probably the largest single market in all of Europe. And this group is both able to extract monopoly profits from the brewing industry as well as to negotiate with the British government.
Now, describe to me that how this same dynamic led to. I think you've already mentioned partly why this is going to be the case. The ad valorem tax on wine hits cheaper wines more heavily, so this created an incentive for the French to develop better and better wines. Is that right?
Okay, yeah, that's right. Well, it's not ad valorem. It's the opposite ad valorem. So it's a specific tariff. It's a volume tariff. So from the French standpoint, they're exporting almost nothing to the British. They're exporting primarily the very best wine. So at first they try to fight by sort of figuring out where else they can export their wine. For various reasons I'm not going to go into, they start having difficulty with a lot of their other markets, in particular with Holland, where they also get into war, who also stops importing a lot of their wine. But what the French figure out is that one of their best ways to sort of, in some sense, make the best of a bad situation is to simply export higher quality wine to the British. And in particular, because the particular specific tariff on French wine is so favorable to the better quality wines, the French go to great pains to, if you like, in modern day terms, improve research and development into winemaking. Mm-hmm. And many of the standard techniques, if you read, for instance, wine histories, they'll discuss the fact in many of the standard techniques that improved the production and the quality control in the wine industry start to take off in the 18th century. Now, I can't directly prove this, but I suspect, and I believe that a lot of this is tied to the fact that a very big outlet for the best wine is Britain. And the British tariffs are such that they favor the very best wines coming in. And so that throughout the 18th century, the French are developing better and better high-end wines. And one of the largest markets for those high-end wines is Britain, which was traditionally the biggest external source of demand for French product.
The thing that I find kind of mind-blowing about this stuff is that you... I guess growing up, you have the sense that that different cultural traditions, like being a beer drinking culture or a wine drinking culture, is something that just emerges organically from the soil of that place. and I love the fact that a system of tariffs and taxes that arose because of a war that happened a long time ago can have these ramifying cultural effects and is still affecting people's sense of cultural identity today. Right, the French still take a huge amount of pride in being a classy wine producer, but a lot of that is just sort of path-dependent effects of a war that occurred in the 17th century. And so that's, I think, the amazing upshot of books like this is showing, it really does show us the story behind the story.
Well, I think part of what's going on is that people's intuition is partially correct in the sense that things like if you have soil and if you have land and if you have areas that are favorable to the growing of wine, then you're going to be predisposed to grow wine. But that doesn't end the story there. In other words, government policy, economic events, changes in technology can modulate what, in some sense, nature gives to us. So that even if you take the United States, for instance, today we take for granted that California is a major producer of wine. But of course, that development of getting to the point where California is a major producer of wine for export is very much a recent phenomenon. It's a phenomenon of the last 30 or 40 years. Now, an interesting issue would have been the case that the California started to produce wine much earlier. Excuse me. But prohibition helped to slow that down. That is to sort of say by in some sense, banning booze all over the United States, you, of course, stopped the momentum for the development of the alcoholic industry, the beverage industry in the United States. And it would be interesting to ask the question that had there been not such strong prohibition movement and you had both prohibition and the war, how much earlier would the California wine industry have developed? Or not? I don't know. How much of this is about the lack of prohibition, how much of this is about simply the rise of a world market? So that in some sense, part of what the story is that whatever national endowments people have, or nations have, these are heavily modulated by forces that are less obvious, including major changes in technology and including changes in regulation and tax policy that are less obvious.
One thing that sort of like classical liberal and libertarians are always trying to make about regulation and all sorts of policy making is that there are just unintended consequences, that you are trying to do one thing and another thing happens. And for some reason, like with thinking about the effect that these tariffs and taxes had on French and British culture, it led me to think of Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He once said the central liberal truth is that government can change culture. And then I think he says, and save it from itself. The idea being that government policy, say like civil rights policy or something like that, can actually change the culture, make people less racist over time, and save the country from internal conflicts. I was thinking that one of the central classical liberal truths is that politics can change culture. Not necessarily to save it from itself, but it changes it in ways that are completely unpredictable at the moment that you're, deciding to levy this tariff.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting lesson. One of the things I found among the things I found very interesting when doing this research were the little tidbits about contemporary opinion or unintended consequences that I really was completely unaware of. For instance, I don't know about you, but I was unaware of the fact that in the early part of the 19th century, the temperance movement, that is the people who later on were the forces behind prohibition, the temperance movement in England, was in favor of free trade in alcohol. That is to sort of say, they perceived that the British tariffs on wine and the high taxes on beer and such led to a very unhealthful style of drinking, whereby there was a mix of beer and rum and hard liquor, and that the temperance movement was allied with the free traders in the early 19th century because it was their perception that while they would have preferred people not to drink at all, it was their perception that a more open trade, and what they meant by free trade meant not only lower tariffs on French wine, but in general open licensing and easy retailing, easy sales of booze, would lead to a more healthful balance of consumption.
Yeah.
And that wine would substitute for much of the hard liquor, and that this would be healthier and better for what they referred to as the lower classes.
That's really interesting. That is pretty much exactly the argument that I mean, it's not the drug warriors are saying that sort of thing, but that's the argument that like the pro-marijuana legalization people will make, or drug legalizers in general, that prohibition creates an incentive for sellers to sell highly concentrated products that tend to be unhealthful. So that if you sort of legalize cocaine, people would take their cocaine in the form of like cocaine tea or cocaine chewing gum, which would be not that much different from having a lot of caffeine. But when cocaine's illegal, it just makes sense to just sell it in its sort of most concentrated distilled form, and then it's highly destructive. So it's kind of interesting to see that the temperance advocates were accepting that argument.
Well, it's very interesting, and like I said, we don't have time to talk about this, but how the temperance movement sort of evolved. And so they initially were free traders, but then later on, at 1860, 1870, they felt it wasn't doing enough, even after they'd moved to much freer trade, and so they started to move to oppose liquor and alcohol in all forms entirely.
Yeah,
In some sense, they got what they wanted, because the Britain did move to a freer trade, but they weren't very happy with the outcome.
So I'm still really interested in this effect, and maybe we can talk about it for just another minute or so. The cultural effects of economic policy.
Go ahead.
And just sort of regulatory policy in general. And so I was trying to think of examples of those in American history, and not necessarily just kinds of economic policy. So things that I think people mention in terms of sort of having to do with the American character. So like the Louisiana Purchase, the sort of Homestead Act, things that sort of basically anything that sort of subsidized land and settlement. I think that probably had a big effect on the American character. But more recently, and I think I've gotten in some fights about this with some of my free market oriented friends. It always struck me that the extent to which America is an automotive or car culture must have had something to do with the extent to which the government has subsidized the interstate highway system. And maybe there was a good reason for it in the first place, and maybe we would have been a car culture anyway. But I'm sort of fascinated by the extent to which the sense of cultural identity is tied to the subsidies that were in place because of whatever government goal was present. And I guess the reason they built the interstate system was, well, partly to build shipping infrastructure, but also partly for the purposes of having places to land airplanes for defense. I don't know if that's true. But
I don't know very much about the details, but it's certainly the case that the choices the U.S. made with respect to the interstate have a lot to do with the way the Americans treat the automobile, aside from the fact that the U.S. is also a very big country. But, it's one of those things, again, where you have to ask yourself, even if you believe that, say, the that sort of the interstate shouldn't have been subsidized or bigger, you have to ask yourself, to what extent are many of the virtues of what we think of as the U.S. experience, in particular the high mobility of the American population, related to the fact that you have this widespread, well-functioning freeway system? and road system. And so in some sense, the fact that Americans are very mobile, that labor is very mobile, that downturns in the economy are modulated by people willing to uproot and move many thousands of miles if necessary. How much of that is aided by the way in which the road system is laid out? So this is one of the kinds of issues. I mean, certainly today, in terms of talking about the role of, say, taxation of gasoline or restraints on carbon emission, one of the things people have to contend with is that any kind of change they're going to make is going to not only have direct effects, but they're going to have huge indirect effects that we may not see till much farther down the road. And this is not a brief for or against a particular set of taxes. It's merely a statement about how difficult it is to foresee what these consequences are, both for the direct effects that are desired, as well as for these indirect issues, such as cultural identity or consumption that has a particular kind of meaning for a nation or an individual.
I want to move on for a second, John, and talk about something else that you've written that has affected me a lot. I know that you know that I'm working on a project on inequality here at Cato, and you wrote a couple columns online for the Econ Lib, or that the Liberty Fund runs on real inequality over time, and I think you bring a sort of insight from economic history that is pretty profound, but that I don't think people have grasped. And in those two articles, you argue that the evidence over time shows that the prices of goods for poorer people have been, or just like the quality of goods for poorer people is improving faster than it has for wealthier people, in effect compressing real consumption, the gap in real consumption over time. And I was especially interested in the examples that you gave between the differences now between, so like if I'm a poor person and a poorer person, and I buy a used car for, I don't know, $2,000 or $3,000. It might not be the nicest car in the world, but I buy a used car that costs, a small fraction of what a brand new luxury car does. Say a Lexus. Correct. Or a. But still, it's pretty. Lamborghini. Or a Lamborghini. But still, it's pretty functionally close. It at least gets me where I'm going in relative comfort. Whereas 200 years ago, the difference would be riding around in a coach and slogging through the mud in your bare feet. And so, even if. Well, can you just sort of amplify on that thought? Because
sure. I mean, I think this is the point I made in my article. But I mean, for the benefit of our viewers, the point I'm making is that in some sense, and other economic historians have made this point. I believe Bob Fogel of the University of Chicago has been most vocal about this. The degree of consumption inequality has declined dramatically when viewed over the long span of time. One way to think about this is that don't think about the measures of income. Just think about what people most want and need. And if you're think about the extreme case. Think about somebody who has everything. Think about a world in which the king has access to all the goods and services in the world, and the poorest person has almost nothing. They barely have enough to eat. They don't have a place to live. Well, then the first thing you'd ask yourself is that what would be the most important things to do if you wanted to equalize the standard of living between the king and the poor peasant? The first thing you would do is make sure that the poor peasant has enough to eat, of better quality food on a regular basis, has clothing to wear, and has a place to sleep, or has lodging of some kind. Once you start doing these things, in some sense, the fact that the king can have a nicer palace or that the carriage can be gilt-edged is as nothing compared to the gain to the peasant of simply having food on a regular basis and of having much, much better food. But from that standpoint, when we look at the kinds of things that the Industrial Revolution and the Second Industrial Revolution have wrought, the changes in production technology have overwhelmingly gone, the benefits have overwhelmingly gone to the poor and lower classes. That is to sort of say, they've lowered the price of food, they've lowered the price of goods, safe food, and in fact, even despite the fact that the poor consume far more food than the poor did, say, 50 or 100 years ago, food as a total share of their spending is much, much smaller in percentage terms. In that sense, that most of the inflation indices and most of the measures of inequality we have understate the benefits to the poor and understate the benefits to the lowest classes and overstate the benefits to the rich. That is, they exaggerate the gains between the rich and the poor. In some sense, to think about it, put it another way, if you imagine that, take the extreme case, imagine that everybody in the world were given a magic box so that everybody in the world could get everything for free.
Yeah.
Except the place where you lived.
Okay.
We would agree that that world would be extremely equal in terms of material goods than it is today. It would be far more equal. A world in which you basically any clothing, any car you want, there's this magic box, you press a button, it pops out, it costs you nothing. So on that world, there's full equality on all economic margins except access to where you live.
Okay.
Well, if now what it turns out is that the value of, say, the richest man's home in a nice area of Manhattan is like $1 billion, and the poorest home is $10,000, the ratio between the rich and poor would seem to be nearly infinite. It would be astonishingly huge.
Yeah.
And yet we would agree that that world would be far more equal than the world today. And that's what happens, however, every time goods which are widely consumed become so cheap that they basically drop out of the equation. The example I like to give that is salt. Salt was so valuable and it was so important that there were very large taxes on it for a long time, and taxes on salt were a major source of contention, of political concern. I believe that the modern word for salary stems from the Latin salarium, which comes from the salt ration received by Roman soldiers during the Roman Empire.
No
Today,
kidding. My salary is my salt money.
That's right.
Wow.
Well, today, salt prices are so trivial. Nobody thinks about salt as a major item in the budget. As far as I know, I don't. My wife likes to worry about coupons, but I've never heard my wife explain, "Oh gosh, John, salt is now 2 for $1 at the grocery store. Let's rush out and buy an extra 10 sacks of salt."
Right.
So in some sense, it simply falls off the radar. And I think this happens with a large number of goods. As low-quality clothing becomes cheaper, as low-quality food becomes cheaper, it sort of falls off the radar. Now people talk about the inequality about healthy foods, or nutritious foods,
right,
or organic foods, or access to cars with the right numbers of safety features, etc., etc., etc. When, of course, the real inequality historically was between people who had to walk versus people who could ride anything.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, this is an issue that's fascinating to me. It reminds me of a paper I read a couple years ago. I don't know, do you know this guy, Jerry Hausman at MIT?
Yeah, of course.
He had a paper on the consumer surplus, the gains in consumer surplus created by Walmart's entry into the grocery business. And I forget what the actual numbers were, but he showed that Walmart brought down prices for groceries quite a lot, and basically showing that the consumer was getting a bigger and bigger chunk of the gains from trade over time by Walmart forcing their competitors to become more and more efficient, and more competitive. And he showed that that minorities and poorer people were the largest beneficiaries of the price drop due to Walmart's competitive pressures. But that sort of thing is not captured by the way we actually measure inequality.
Well, that's right. I mean, I was just thinking of Thanksgiving recently. I was talking to my family, and I was talking to my wife and sons, and we were looking at the turkey. We bought a big turkey, I think, on sale. I think it cost us $11 at the supermarket. Mm-hmm. And if I understand correctly, I could be off by a few bucks here or there. My understanding is that that's how much a turkey cost in nominal dollars 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So if a turkey cost like $8 to $12 like 100 years ago, considering that large numbers of people rarely made over a few $100s a year, then that was like an enormous sum of money. That is to sort of say, it would be as if that $10 turkey had cost like $100 or $200 now. And we just don't think about it. Or think about the fact that among the kind of so-called promises of the sort of the promises that politicians make every year that people sort of dismiss, such as like lower taxes, was one of the older promises. The claims was a chicken in every pot. Well, that was considered to be such a utopian kind of statement that nobody took it seriously. And yet today we are at the point in the United States where, except for a very few unfortunate people, the vast majority of Americans can afford to have chicken on a fairly regular basis.
I might have a chicken sandwich here in about 20, 30 minutes. Yeah. John, let's talk for a second. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I want you to talk a little bit about some of your most recent research, which isn't so much economic history, but it's more of a sort of a Freakonomic style investigation of
I know what you're talking about.
Chess. So you've been arguing that you've got evidence that the Soviets were colluding in championship chess. And I don't know if there are any chess buffs. And we've got a very, very intelligent audience, and so I'm sure there's some chess fans out there. So can you tell them how it is that you sussed out evidence of... I mean, I always knew the Soviets were cheaters. I mean, growing up during the Cold War. But can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Well, okay, so here's how it started. So in the early 60s, Bobby Fischer claimed that the Soviets had been colluding in major championships by agreeing to an inordinate number of draws amongst themselves in the competitions which determined the challenger for the world championship. And the claim was that by taking many draws amongst themselves, they were able to conserve energy without necessarily doing substantially worse, and then beat up on the non-Soviet players in the tournament. Other chess players, other grandmasters have said similar things from time to time over the years, but for the most part, Bobby Fischer's claims were either dismissed out of hand as being unlikely. People would sort of say, well, how can draws matter, and how do you get evidence for it? Or were taken at face value. People just sort of say, yes, of course they did this. Well, the problem is that absent a smoking gun, absent hard, solid documentary proof that, they just sort of said, hey, yes, in this tournament we mapped out this and this is what we did, how would you even begin to figure out that such a thing occurred? Mm-hmm. And I thought that this was a great place to do some sort of statistical analysis, sort of, as you said, Freakonomic style tests. Yeah. Of the material, and it turns out that chess is very good for this, because in some sense, unlike most other sports, you have virtually a perfect record of every game. You have all the moves of the games of all the major contests. Moreover, chess has a rating system that's very mathematically precise, that allows you, with fine degrees of precision, to talk about what the relative strengths are of various players. Well, what we did was we looked at the period from the end of World War II to the period in which Bobby Fischer made this complaint. And we looked at all the World Championship tournaments and the tournaments leading up to the World Championship in which the Soviets were involved. And we looked at their performance in those tournaments, and we were able to compare their behavior to the behavior of the same Soviet players in the all-Soviet tournaments. See, this is the point. We did observe that there were a lot of draws among Soviets in the World Championship tournaments. The problem is that simply having lots of draws doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing something fishy, because as tournaments get more difficult, as the player quality increases, you normally have lots more draws. That is, games between advanced players are much more likely to arrive at draws than games between much weaker players. Right. But having this baseline of comparison, this control group of the performance of the Soviets, both in their all-Soviet tournaments, where there's no incentive to draw amongst themselves, versus the same performance of these same Soviets in the foreign tournaments, we were able to show not only that they draw substantially more in a statistically meaningful sense, but that those draws translated into higher performance. That is to sort of say, they outperformed what their ratings would have predicted they would have done in the tournament. Just on the basis of their relative strength. So we could not only show that there were more draws, but we could quantify the approximate benefit in terms of how much of a boost that gave to their performance. The other thing we were able to do is, that's very interesting, as a result of the Fischer claims, in 1964, the World Chess Federation changed the rules for the championship tournaments so that there was no more incentive for draws. That is, they changed a knockout-style tournament so that you played a match with one guy and the winner moved on to the next level. So there's no more advantage to draws. And what we did was we looked at the period after the rules were changed. And what did we find? We found that Soviet outperformance disappeared. In other words, it's not that Soviets still weren't very good, but the performances matched their ratings almost exactly. So as would have been predicted, once the draw rules or rather, once the tournament rules were changed, so there were no incentives for these collusive draws, then the performance gains would also disappear, which in fact they did. Well, so that this is the paper we've written, and now it's sort of sitting around waiting for the usual problem of getting into a good journal and
that's just
getting
neat.
Referees past referees.
Yeah, with the advance of good econometric techniques, I think it's getting harder and harder to cheat, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean. I mean, there's large sorts of cheating that that's sort of not about econometrics, but cheating in specific circumstances. I think that the rash of accusation of cheating now with very good chess computers, the issue that's going to be one of the fact that, particularly for mid-level players, but even at the grandmaster level, if there's some way, for instance, to have a little earpiece in which you can receive information and somebody can broadcast the output of a computer, it becomes possible to cheat in mid-level tournaments. And this is, in some sense, one of the issues, that is to sort of say there have been accusations of various people winning tournaments with, in fact, an earpiece or somehow receiving notes so that somebody else outside the tournament is watching the games and inputting the moves into a chess computer and then making suggestions to them and things of that sort. Now that you have computers that can reliably beat all but perhaps 100 people in the world, it becomes much more of an issue than it was historically.
Mm-hmm. How physically taxing is like championship level chess? Is it really?
Oh, it's extremely taxing. I mean, there's a reason that. Remember, especially in the traditional tournaments, they would often play for like 8-9 hour sessions, and there'd be a German, you play the next day, you're doing this day after day under extreme stress. Most of the major during the World Championship tournament, it was routine for challengers to the World Championship to lose weight, to lose 10, 20 pounds. I think Karpov, in one of his tournaments, one of his World Championship matches, lost 15, 20 pounds over the course of the World Championship match. Bobby Fischer trained fairly vigorously. He played tennis regularly, ate huge breakfast for the World Championship match with Boris Spassky in Iceland. Most of the Soviet champions and the top grandmasters had Soviet trainers provided with everything from, I don't know, I've heard of things from vitamins to medication to masseurs. I think Garry Kasparov played soccer on a regular basis to keep fit. It's not a surprise that the World Champions have tended to be have almost never been people over their mid-30s.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That is to sort of
that's actually how I keep thin, John, is as I eat anything that I want, but I think so intensely here in my think tank that the fat just melts away. I think there could be a diet book about like losing weight by thinking really, really hard.
Well, if you figure out a way to sell that, I'll sell that to my wife, who doesn't believe I do anything at work. So that's another story.
The brain is a huge calorie-intensive organ. Hey, this reminds me. Speaking of, I don't know why it reminds me, but back briefly, just for a second, about wine and beer.
Sure.
One of the things that amazed me was just how much people drank back then. It's just because, I mean, the fact that you could really raise a significant amount of money through excise taxes on alcohol was like, how much did people drink?
Well, we don't have all the numbers because there's a large amount of drinking that's sort of also, particularly in the provinces, that's based upon sort of local liquors. But there's a substantial amount. The better way to think about it is that why shouldn't they drink? Alcohol, or rather a lot of booze, particularly things like beer or cider or hard ciders or wine, were usually the safest drinks available to people in much of the Western world. Why is that? Well, think about it. Water's often contaminated, particularly in the cities. Milk is subject to problems prior to pasteurization, is not widely available. There's no fruit juice for the most part. So the only safe drinks are drinks that in some sense boiled or processed like alcohol. Tea and coffee don't take off till like the 18th century. So it's not surprising that prior to sort of the advent of things like tea and coffee, that the safest drink for most people is probably alcohol. Indeed, I've seen data suggesting that, for instance, in Dutch orphanages in the 18th century, I think this is something that Jan de Vries of Berkeley sent me, in Dutch orphanages, very often the largest single item in the budget for little children was beer.
Yeah. Because in traditional societies, people cared so much more about their children. I mean, it's a good way to get them to go to sleep if you can drug the kids before they have a Schlitz, Tinny, and you'll.
But seriously, also even in the 19th century, even during the times of the debates about the Corn Laws, many people talked about tariffs and taxes on alcohol as interfering with the daily bread of people, because in some sense, say, the consumption of, say, beer or wine is a very good source of calories, as well as a kind of narcotic for a lot of people.
Yeah, but before I thought about the fact that people that I was actually thinking at one point about whether the elasticity of demand for alcohol has gone down, because partly I was just wondering if people felt so miserable back then that they wanted to be drunk all the time. And so if the elasticity in demand for alcohol has decreased, then that would say that people now feel better sober than they used to. They don't need the alcohol in order to not feel miserable. But the fact that there really wasn't any clean water to drink kind of interferes with that hypothesis, I think.
Well, it's more complicated than that too. Plus, there's the other factor that as people. I mean, so on the one hand, there's fewer alternatives to drink, both from a health standpoint and from an entertainment perspective. But on the other hand, there's the well-known observation that in all societies, that as people get richer, they consume more alcohol on the average, but they consume it in different forms. So that today, there's at least some evidence that you're seeing a shift in patterns of consumption in the United States, say, and in many countries in the world, away from the harder liquors towards, say, wine and beer.
I was just looking at the BLS's Big Consumption Survey. I forget what the name of the data set is, and looking at. For some reason, I was just interested to see if there was a category of good that poorer people consumed at a higher rate than wealthier people. Alcohol was one of those in which the amount spent by people they have a special series now for tracking the expenditures of just wealthier people, because there's actually a lot of difference between people who make $80,000 a year and people who make over $200,000 a year. And people who make over $200,000 a year don't spend that much more on alcohol than people who make 80, which was interesting. The one thing that seems to go the other way, that people who make less spend more, is tobacco, interestingly enough.
Okay. Yes, well, I didn't know that. But I can believe that.
Yeah, I mean, at some points in the district, I mean, I'm sure that they spend, as you go down the income distribution, the percentage of their income spent on tobacco is larger, but it might actually be even a larger absolute amount, and that might be because it's actually quite rare for wealthy people to smoke anymore because of just different sort of mores and habits about health. So you do get very different consumption patterns at different ends of the spectrum. But then again, I would like to see what it is. Like people who make $200,000 a year do spend more on alcohol than people who make $80,000 a year. But I'd like to see what it is that they're spending it on. So it's not obvious that they're drinking less or drinking more. They just might be buying more expensive wine.
His phone is off.
John, are you still there? Did you get dropped? I think I've lost John on the telephone. And we're out of time anyway. So goodbye.